Welcome to Intersect, a podcast where we find connection in each other's story. A quote attributed to Ben Franklin says, "A penny saved is a penny earned." However, he didn't coin it, according to yourdictionary.com. In his 1937 Poor Richard's Almanac, Franklin delivered the line, "A penny saved is 2 pence clear." And later in 1737, It's 1737, Poor Richard's Almanac. And then later in 1758, he wrote a version closer to the saying we know when he said, "A penny saved is a penny got." I wondered if he spoke in some old English, got. Anyways, so he never used the word earned. Mm-hmm. Well, we're here with Katelyn, Kelch, and my friend Ashley, Ortiz. Mm-hmm. And we are intersecting today. Mm-hmm. We're here at Intersect. We find connection in each other's story, and Katelyn is one of our student leaders here at the University Church, and we got to talking a while back. Katelyn, just tell us briefly about yourself, and then you have something to say about pennies, but let's hear about you just for a minute, and then let's talk about pennies.
Yeah, of course. So I am currently attending Southern Adventist University. I'm studying to become a physical therapist assistant, and I actually graduate this year in December.
Yay!
So very excited about that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So, it's been quite a journey. I'm currently finishing up some classes, and then I'll be going on my last clinical rotations. So
fun.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Very excited about that. Mm-hmm. So talking about pennies.
Yes. For your thoughts.
Yes. Yeah. So my family has something where we collect pennies that we find just wherever. And the reason why we started this, it goes back to actually when my mom was about my age in college, and my grandmother had heard a story of a woman who collected pennies, and each time she found a penny, it was that reminder to trust in God, just like the inscription says, and that it reminded her it was almost like a hug from God. So my family started doing that, my grandmother started doing that, and it carried on until the time that my brother was born. Now, when my brother Ryan was born, he had to have surgery within the first 24 hours of his birth. It was a very stressful time for my parents, and I barely remember it. I was about 2 when he was born. But he had the first surgery, and then when he was 3 months old, he had to have a second surgery. And during that time, right before the surgery, the nurses were trying to get an IV in, and it just was not going well. And my mom just had to step away from the situation because it was just tearing her apart. Mm-hmm. So she went down to the hospital cafeteria just to get away and get something to eat. And she got a sandwich, and she went to try to find a place to eat, but the cafeteria was just filled with people. And she just did not want to have a conversation with somebody. So she ended up finding an empty table off in the corner. And before she set her tray down, something caught her eye on the TV that was above the table. But the table that she was at, there was nothing on it. It was clean, nobody sitting there. Mm-hmm. And then the minute she looked back down to set her tray on the table, there was a penny sitting at the seat right next to her.
Oh, that's so fantastic.
Yeah. So, that's the biggest story that it was honestly feels like a little miracle, and just that reminder that God was taking care of my family during that time. And, my brother is doing great. He's actually here at Southern this year, which is very nice.
So exciting.
I'm so happy to have him here with me. So that was one of the biggest stories where we're like, okay, God was working in that. And then just throughout the years, just collecting, and sometimes it's not even during a rough period of our life. And I have like a mason jar that's almost full now that I started on my own, like in high school. But there's been so many times, whether I'm having a bad day, like I didn't do well on a test, I end up finding a penny. And it's just a really good reminder that God is still there through all the good and the hard times. And it's just great thinking about like God giving you a hug. It's just something so special. So
I love that.
And it kind of like nothing's small, right?
yeah,
Nothing ever is small.
yeah.
I mean, the penny, yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. So, and something that to continue that we had talked about a little bit when I had shared this story with you initially, Pastor Jim, I had actually just come back from a mission trip in Alaska. And I actually had the opportunity to preach there the one Sabbath that we were there. And I actually talked about this story about the pennies. And then I also shared, connecting it with the Bible, I shared this story where the Israelites were crossing the Jordan River and they built those altars of remembrance. And I challenged the church that we were at in Alaska to just formulate their own altar, whether it is collecting pennies like my family has, or journaling about those moments where God's worked in your life, or collecting rocks and writing words on them to remind you like how God's worked. And it was just an amazing experience getting to talk about that and share with a larger group of people. And it also kind of gave me a revelation moment about my journey with God and the times where I struggled to trust him. It's interesting because I feel like I've never necessarily struggled. I always feel like God is always working in my life, but I always have those doubts when I'm in the moment. When I'm looking back on my life and seeing how God's worked, I'm like, yeah, he was there. Like, he's an amazing God who cares for us throughout all that we're going through. And I struggle with it because it's like, it's so ironic that I still doubt when those times come around, even though I can tell you so many times that God's worked in my life. So it's something I'm really struggling with right now and just grappling with.
Just that idea of why is it so easy to recognize God looking back, but in the present moment, sometimes it's a struggle. So you feel like that's been a challenge?
Exactly.
Why do you think, what makes that so challenging?
I guess I'm just hard on myself. Because it's like, well, I clearly recognize that God's there, so why can't I trust him in those hard moments when I know he's worked there before?
Yeah, trust is a real issue for all of us, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. But interestingly enough, I feel like I'm starting to have a little bit of a breakthrough with that.
How did that happen?
Just like a culmination of things actually recently. As I'm like prepping myself to graduating and having to go out on my own and kind of adult, it's been a lot to think about. And I actually had a situation just this week of when I was coming up here to Southern to move into the dorm, there was actually a situation where I had to get moved to Village. And for me, I don't like changes in plans. And this was happening the day of that I was moving in.
And just to clarify, so Village is like, dorm is like, big high-rise housing,
Yes.
hallways, I don't know. I guess each room has a shower, but the Village is more like living like in a townhouse.
Yeah, like our apartment.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. And so, anyways, just that process of all of a sudden my plans changed. I had to be like, okay, it's okay. Like, don't panic. We're going to get this taken care of. And strangely enough, I was like, okay, God's just got this. And it was just this revelation. There wasn't necessarily anything causing that. I was just like, okay, we've got this. And I mean, this week it was tough. We got thrown back into classes and lots of homework and all that stuff. And I was definitely feeling very stressed and overwhelmed. But throughout this whole week, I've just, in the back of my head, is just like, okay, God's going to take care of this. Like, he's got me on the right path.
You know you're doing the right thing and you're capable.
Exactly.
Yeah. You know, what you're saying reminds me of this thing Brene Brown tells about the anatomy of trust. She did a thing with Oprah one time on a Sunday morning.
So good.
Yeah.
Soul Sunday.
Do you remember? And she talks about the marble jar. Can you tell us about that? If you remember? No.
Not as well as you.
Ashley's like, I'm just going to say it a little bit.
Yeah.
So, okay, so the marble jar thing was that she was trying to teach her daughter about trust. And I think there was an acronym for it, like braving. And I don't remember all what the acronym means, but there was this one point that she brought out that she's like trying to help her daughter understand that trust happens like one little micro
Right.
gift or generosity or moment at a time.
Right.
And so she's like, it's kind of like the marble jar, you know, that your teacher has. Or maybe the daughter said it. I don't know. Anyways, she was, and she's like, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Well, like every time somebody in the classroom does something nice, our teacher puts a marble in the jar. And, you know, eventually that jar, kind of like your penny jar, fills up. And she goes, oh, okay, I think I get it. And then and Brene's like, do you have any marble jar friends? And she thinks, and she goes, Susie. Well, why is Susie a marble jar friend? I just made the name up, but we'll guess. And she goes, well, because like when we were on the soccer field, like she remembered Meemaw's name, Granny's name. That makes her a marble jar friend? Yeah. Like she just remembered Meemaw's name. So, you know, like that moment of maybe finding pennies carries into the present moment of like, I'm okay. It's kind of fascinating.
Oh, yeah. Trust is a fascinating topic and issue and lifelong kind of adventure.
Yeah.
Especially with each other, but even more, especially with something you can't see.
Yeah.
With God.
You
Yeah.
can't see God.
Yeah.
So that makes it even that much more difficult.
Well, and I think that's where the penny jar is so special for me, and I need to think about it more often because it is kind of that visual.
Right.
Something more tangible, even if I may not remember exactly what each penny, like each time I found it, what it pertained to. I think I probably should put it in a more prominent place in my room so I see it more often as a good reminder.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that. I'm going to have to start collecting pennies.
I know. Just looking for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything in your life that you feel like the penny jar takes you back to that's a similar kind of remembrance?
Well, my mother passed recently, and that is a huge trust issue right there. You
Just
know,
like trusting through the grief.
trusting through the grief, trusting that God has her, which I have no question about whatsoever. My mom was such a big believer, and her faith was very strong, and all those things, you know. But still, you don't know, really, do you?
Only God knows, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. It boils down to trust. And just like this whole complete surrender to the process of death. And, you know, like why this is happening right now seemed a little bit unfair because she was so sweet and so loving and so kind and so giving. She held our family together. And then now we're going to lose her? What are you talking about? Come on. We don't need to lose her. But I did have her for a long time. I mean, relatively speaking. So I'm very blessed in that regard. But still, her loss was definitely another level of trust that I found myself going through. So, yeah.
I'm going through some of that myself, just with stuff going on where experiencing a loss professionally, and then you just, in leading up to that, anticipating, is that coming? Is that coming? There's a story in the Bible, David and Bathsheba, not the best story in the world, and a little affair going on there.
It's a complete fail.
A complete fail. Pregnancy. God's like, this baby's going to die. And David's begging and pleading, no, Lord, save the child. Save the child. Pouring his heart out, tears, blubbering, whatever. And then the child dies. And I feel like the journey I've been on, it's like, okay, the child's dead. And so grief is a funny thing too, because sometimes it happens on the back end of an event. Sometimes it comes before. Like sometimes our losses are anticipated,
Yes. Yeah, we know in advance that we're going to, like my mom's cancer diagnosis, we knew that she, any type of diagnosis like that, you're anticipating the loss.
Yeah.
It's really real.
Yeah.
But you don't believe it until they're literally down, for the count, so to speak. I'm not trying to make light of it. I'm just saying that all along you're like, well, maybe the treatment is working, or maybe, it's not going to happen as fast as what the doctors had said, or what about that particular type of cancer.
Yeah.
So you're just always hopeful.
Right. Right. Yeah.
You're just always hopeful.
Yes.
So, but hope is a good thing.
It is.
Hope is a kind of a bit of a sweet reprieve to some of our trust issues, quite frankly. So,
and
there's always tomorrow.
Paradoxically, it feels like trust grows through grief.
It does. No doubt about it.
If we're, I guess maybe if we're receptive or willing to kind of, I don't know, on my journey, I've found myself going like, sometimes people want to dismiss the darker emotions. And I had somebody say to me recently, don't suppress it, surrender it.
I like that. Don't suppress it, surrender it. Yeah.
So to truly surrender something, you almost have to own it first.
Don't you have to communicate it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just having a conversation with my hubby this morning. Tell me when you're grumpy. Communicate it. But then that requires ownership.
Yeah.
Doesn't it? To admit it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you're feeling anxiety, if you're feeling depression, if you're feeling whatever,
say it.
Say it. And I think profoundly something happens when we have people we can say it to. Yeah.
Yeah. And something thinking along those lines, like and tying back into like trusting in God. I had my freshman year of coming into college, I was dealing with a lot of grief, actually. I had two friends, like in two different situations that were around my age, pass away. And that was a hard thing to do, especially when it's somebody your age and just realizing how short life is. But I realized throughout that period of time, I was talking to God the most. And some of it was questioning, some of it was like, God, just help me get through this time period, because it was definitely one of my lowest moments of life, just because, I had lived at home through high school as well. And so this was my first time being away from home, and family is a huge part of who I am. And so there was just a lot of stuff going on. But again, I found that was when I was talking to God the most. Even if it wasn't fully trusting, I was at least having that conversation with him and communicating with him, which I think is so important.
Well, and I feel like communication with God is trust. Like, I think sometimes we sell ourselves short, or we gauge our interaction with God as like, I should be feeling this way, when actually I should just be stating what I'm feeling.
I think I struggle with that.
I think we all do
Yeah.
to a certain extent. I mean, and some days are better than others, right? And being able to communicate, articulate like what's going on, or articulating that with someone that we love, or, you know, a friend or whoever. But yeah, or with the Lord, just telling him. But I think telling our stories to others is incredibly healing. There's something about the process. You know, the Bible says to confess our sins. And I think we've kind of pigeonholed, or we've put that whole sin word in a box and we said, this is what it is. But what that really means is just like telling our story.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
I mean,
Totally agree.
It's just telling people, you know, or living our truth versus trying to hide or cover it up in some way through some sort of addiction.
You know, I think it's so interesting because when you say that, the story that came to my mind was, you know, Jairus has come to Jesus. He's like, my daughter's sick. So he's an important guy, ruler of the, you know, the synagogue. And they're on their way to see his daughter, going to do the big miracle for the big man. And Jesus feels this brush of the hem of his robe as he's surrounded by people.
But wasn't both people, the rich, powerful man and the poor, nobody woman, they were both desperate.
They were both desperate.
They were both very desperate. So it doesn't really matter your socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Both of them had suffered. Both of them, I'm sure, loved. I mean, Jairus loved his daughter very much, which motivated him. But he was desperate. I mean, that took a lot of submission.
And their stories intersect in that his daughter was 12 years old and the woman has the flow of blood for 12 years.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
Wow.
And there was
I hadn't
both
thought
women.
about that.
It was a powerful man working for a girl.
Yes.
Even though, I mean, it was his
Yes.
daughter, but it was a
Yes.
girl.
Yes. And then it's a powerful man
Yeah.
recognizing
Yes.
when a desperate woman is reaching out for his power.
Wow.
We could just go off on another podcast with that whole thought.
So, but in coming back to what you said about that, there's something in the power of your story being told.
Yeah.
And Jesus could have just walked on by.
Yeah.
But he goes, no, she needs to be seen and heard.
Right. And he could have gotten to it later, even.
Yeah. I mean, he could have done the one-on-one.
Yeah.
But in that particular instance, he feels like, no, she needs to be seen and heard.
Right now.
Yep.
Beautiful.
Like, who touched me?
Yeah.
I also think about this fact that when he says your faith has made you well, I go like, I don't know, like my faith. But what if it's just your faith is focused in the right direction? What if Jesus is like, I'm your faith? And what if Jesus shows up? When he shows up, faith shows up. And I don't know. What do you think about
Well,
that?
I mean, yeah.
Well, and I think some of it is too just knowing that God is capable of stuff.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure she had some doubts. I'm sure she was like, okay, maybe this won't work, but I have to give it everything.
Yeah.
And I can kind of resonate with that of just, it's like, okay, I know what God's capable of, and I'm going to ask him for everything, but it's ultimately up to him.
Yeah.
Well, it's realizing that ultimately it is up to him.
And surrendering.
Yeah. I mean, that was the thing. She was so desperate. Her faith motivated her.
Yeah.
But there was an intersection of faith and desperation. And then she did some work.
Yeah, to get through the crowd.
She had to push her way through that crowd.
Wow.
You know, and the Bible tells us to, seek, chase, pursue. God wants to be pursued.
And it's so hard sometimes to pursue when we feel like things are well.
Yeah, we're not motivated. Suffering motivates us.
Yeah.
Easy Street does not.
I believe because I bleed.
Well,
In her case, well, okay, that was bad.
Oh,
yeah,
gosh.
it's a little crass.
Okay. Caleb, you might need to edit that one out.
It's okay.
So what's our takeaway today? Like, we've talked about pennies. We've talked about grief. We've talked about
Suffering, desperation, desperation.
desperados.
Yeah. The D word, I can't say it.
Yeah. What's the takeaway as you guys have heard and reflected and experienced?
Sorry, my brain just blanked. We'll edit this out as well.
Nah, it's all fun.
Nah. Something that I was thinking about that I didn't want to share was just an illustration that I had a friend share actually just last week. There was this man, and he had a clock sitting in his lap, and he was looking at this clock, and the clock was running out of time, and he was like, okay, God, I'm ready for that next phase. Like, hey, time's running out for me. You need to do the next big thing. And God spoke to him, was like, I've got a completely different clock.
Wow.
And just that reminder that sometimes we have this plan and we're like, okay, God, we want you to do this. We're expecting you to do this. And God's like, I've got something else in mind. And that plays into the trust aspect. But that's something that's helped me in my journey. Within this past week of just that reminder that sometimes what I'm expecting is not what God has planned.
Right.
So it's just a really good reminder.
Right. I love that. That's a great little story.
Completely different clock. So that brings to mind, that triggers just a little thing that, as I've been on this professional roller coaster, plans for the future from a book called Ministry of Healing. Many are unable to make definite plans for the future. Their life is unsettled. They cannot discern the outcome of affairs, and this often fills them with anxiety and unrest. Let us remember that the life of God's children in this world is a pilgrim life. We have not wisdom to plan our own lives. It is not for us to shape our future. Hebrews 11:8 says, by faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he went out, not knowing whither he went. Christ in his life on earth made no plans for himself. He accepted God's plans for him. And day by day the Father unfolded his plans. So should we depend on God, that our lives may be the simple outworking of his will. As we commit our ways to him, he will direct our steps. Too many, in planning for a brilliant future, make an utter failure. Let God plan for you. As a little child, trust to the guidance of him who will keep the feet of his saints, as 1 Samuel 2:9 says. God never leads his children otherwise than they would choose to be led if they could see the end from the beginning and discern the glory of the purpose which they are fulfilling as co-workers with him.
I like that. That's very nice.
So be content in uncertainty.
Yeah.
What I think we need to Right, because I think sometimes we get tripped up that we're like, okay, life is perfect because we're with God. But it's like, that doesn't change. Life is still hard. It's just God is there as a helper. We have that hope that can carry us through those hard times where other people don't necessarily have that hope.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it special with our journey with God. And we just have to continue to trust.
And Ashley, final word.
Final words. Yeah, continue to trust. And as you build that trust, as you work through your trust, I would just say my final words is be open with others, be open with yourself about it, and just keep on keeping on. Don't give up. Work at it, like the poor lady that you were talking about, from the Bible story of how she just like pushed her way through that crowd to reach the hem of Jesus's robe. She didn't give up.
Yes.
And I would just say, don't give up. Tomorrow's another day.
Amen. So that's it for Intersect this week. In grief and in glory, there's always more to this story. There's a penny waiting. God bless. Go in His grace.